Hi there, I am Loren M. Hill, your academic career coach, and I thank you so much again for joining us. And today we have someone who I very much admired and have even followed in her footsteps, and that is Dr. Sher Downing. Welcome. How are you today, Dr. Downing?
Hello there. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here today.
So let's jump right in. And first, let's talk about your company, EdTech. So tell us about EdTech.
So what we do is Downing EdTech works with all facets of the EdTech area. So we work with innovation, companies that are producing products, so hardware and software, apps, think of the things you use every day on your phone. We work with e-learning development and planning and training. So that can be courses you take online, that can be short trainings that you take online, and we can build those, for people, or we can help them strategize and build them within their companies. But we also do a lot of work with digital transformation. So after the pandemic, we saw a lot of companies that had flipped their model for 2 years. Now we're deciding, do we just go back to the way it was? Do we have kind of a hybrid portion? And so we do a lot of strategic planning with companies and with businesses and even small entrepreneurial groups who are just trying to figure out, how do we go forward from the pandemic? How do we keep our audience? How do we keep working and providing digital, connectivity and products? And so that we're not caught off guard like we were the last time when the pandemic first started. So we do a lot of work in the online space. We love it. We work with all different sizes of companies, and we really just enjoy, seeing what's out there and what's coming.
So hang on, listeners. I want you to stay with us because you might say, well, wow, what would this have to do with academic career advancement? And we're going to get there. And so I want to let you all know that Sher has authored books. She's, been interviewed by who's who, and her company is really phenomenal. They're doing great work. And I want you to know that even though she's talking about large companies, she does work with individuals as well, doing coaching
Mhm.
and small startups and even micro businesses. So hang in there. Now, one of the things that you mentioned was about e-learning, right? And having a digital platform for that. And what I know about you is that you co-authored a book about asking why women should have an online course. And so can you tell us a bit about why you think we should have an online course?
Absolutely. So I think, women are truly kind of the root of entrepreneurialism. We are always looking at doing multiple things at once. We made multitasking hip before it was really in, but we teach naturally. We teach children, we teach family members, we help others through organizations and volunteering. So when women go out and decide they want to start their own business, or they're testing the waters and they want to see if it's something that could be lucrative, think about people who do, ceramics, who do paintings, who think, wow, could I sell my artwork? Could I make a business out of this? Having a course is a great way to do that. It gives you the opportunity to put your information out there. You can charge a small fee for it. You can really test the waters and also see what you like about teaching, what you like about giving and pushing that forward. Um, when you're looking at really starting a business and you're thinking big, you're thinking, here's what I'm going to do, here's where I'm going to hang my shingle and all. You want that passive income. You want something that's steadily coming in while you're getting everything else up and running. And a course is a great way to do that. Use your knowledge, use your expertise, share with others, charge them to take that information and learn from it. But also, you're having a steady income of people taking your course while you're off to the side, really gearing up and doing other things. So I think a course is a great way to really just decide where you're going and what's going to be next. Oftentimes people will do a lot of courses going forward. Sometimes they'll stick with just the same one, and it doesn't matter. It's your call what's going to fit best with what it is you want to do.
And so the reason that I bring this up is because we're sort of backing into your story, right? And so we're talking about this e-learning, building your own course, building your platform. And for those of us who are academicians, we're faculty member, we've taught, this seems like it might be a pretty natural thing for us to do, build courses and then perhaps take some of our content and put it online. Is that what we're talking about too?
Absolutely. When you think of it, oftentimes when you're a faculty member or even as a staff member, if you're a director and above, how many times have you been asked to do a presentation on something? Something that you do well, something that you're knowledgeable about. And it's not necessarily an academic presentation. It could be something for a local chamber of commerce. It could be for a Rotary luncheon, but somebody thinks you have knowledge that they want you to share. Oftentimes you have people who have a hobby and their hobby is really lucrative. I think of one faculty member I know who has a surfboard business. He builds surfboards, custom made, wonderful, they're beautiful, but he's a full-time academic. This has always been a hobby for him. Now it's slowly transitioning into a business because word has gotten out, people have seen him, people have started asking for them for special occasions, graduation gifts, those kinds of things. So you never know what you're doing that may have a high-end value outside of that traditional 15-week lecture, 75 PowerPoint slides later kind of thing. You have that opportunity and you've probably already been doing it all along. It's when you look back at your career and you look back at the things that you've done that are not directly academically related, that you start to see your story build and you start to see the things that you've done or are doing, and you can start to see how you can make that into something else.
So I said we were backing into your story, and it sounds like all of these things have to do with perhaps pivoting, right? And
Mm.
you were in higher ed for a number of years. And was this an approach that you took? Were you faculty? Were you an administrator? Or you had a job in higher ed, whatever that might have been? And then you thought, like, there's an opportunity for me to do something in industry. Was that your process?
Absolutely. So I spent 35 years in higher education. Um, I still do some adjunct work, but for those 35 years, I was full time. And most of the time, I was dual appointment. So I was an administrator with a faculty role. I did all the right things that one does in academia. I earned 4 degrees. I moved up, the ladder, so to speak, in academia. And so when I left, I was a vice chancellor. That was my final role. And what I learned along the way was my first 10 years was in student services, loved working in admissions, loved working with students and advising and such. Moved to the academic side. And around that time was when online learning really took off, mid 90s. So my career kind of grew up with the industry, working with, version ones of every software that was out there at the time. Some of them are still out there. Learning how to build online, actually did my academic, 2 of my degrees in instructional design focuses. So I had built this career in a segment of academia that was new. So it wasn't just academic affairs, it wasn't just student affairs, it was almost an auxiliary area that schools were starting to grow into. And learned so much throughout the years while I was teaching in those fields, while I was teaching in education. I also stepped away from traditional academia. I worked in the for-profits for a little bit. I worked in the nonprofits for a little bit, and I worked in corporate training for a little bit. And what I did was I just was starting to glean all of that information and determine what was going to be best for whomever I was working for. So what were the best practices? So kept moving up and quickly realized that the next level of role was going to be either a provost or a president, because I had reached the top of that particular silo, which is true of faculty members and administrators. You get to a point where you've reached that pinnacle of that particular area, and there's really only two positions left, neither of which I had any interest in. Knew that from the get go. Just, I like being in a niche area. I like understanding and learning new things. So started thinking about what was going to be next, because my next move would have to be lateral and just in a different school. But I'm not happy maintaining things. I like problem solving. I like, figuring these things out. And so started thinking about, going off and doing consulting, using all of that experience and all of that knowledge that I had gained over the years, still keep my, toes in academia by teaching occasionally or working with dissertation students, but really just stepping away from that. And so looking at the industry, everyone was now getting involved with online training and trying to decide how they were going to work with remote learners. Even before the pandemic, companies were buying, acquisitions and mergers were at an all-time high, and suddenly would have teams in other countries and other states that they were having to deal with. So the timing, watching for that was important. Laying out a plan for how this was going to roll out. Obviously, you never can stick entirely to a plan, but you kind of have a guideline of how you're going to go forward. And then looking at stepping back to faculty for a year and then stepping out entirely and saying, okay, this is the direction I'm going to go. So it definitely can be done. I think one of the things that we don't realize when we're in academia, because we are very siloed in a structure, is that we have great value to industry. And industry is now starting to realize that more than ever. It was academics who helped them figure out the pandemic. And they saw that quickly, and they relied on advisors. They relied on local institutions. They relied on technology, but the technology was already being used at an institution. And so it was easy to manipulate it to work for an industry. So now, fast forward, it's better time than ever for academics who are choosing to do something different, whether that's part-time or full-time, whether they're working for someone or working on their own, but taking that knowledge and expertise and really just repackaging yourself and going back out there.
That's so great. And I think very timely, because we did or still are in a pandemic, depending on, how you look at it, right? And so people are really reflecting on what they want to do next. And some of that is, sort of motivated by internal processes, but some institutions are suffering from enrollment decline. They haven't yet recovered from that. And we all know sort of the matrix that we look at is not just the year that the student comes in, but the 4 years that they would have been in that institution in terms of resources, right? Meaning they would have been
Right.
tuition. So if that isn't happening and they're still trying to sort of dig back out from that, then institutions are cutting, right? Maybe their contracts aren't being renewed, or departments that might have been sort of fragile to begin with are now, they're having to rethink this. So you, as I think, as a faculty, as an administrator, even as a staff member, thinking about what you can do outside of higher ed, I think is a good strategy all the time. Since I help people with academic career coaching, I'm often encouraging them to think beyond your next promotion or your next job, but like, what is your career going to look like? What is your vision for your career? And so these are just steps along the way. And if we have a vision, then we can really be thinking long term.
Absolutely. I mean, I think back to early in my career, and I can remember talking to people who had been in academia for a while then, who, if you're landlocked, meaning you live in a small area where there's minimal schools, or you live in an area where schools are very difficult to get into, you would see people saying, boy, that next role is sitting right there. And in 10 years, when that person retires, I'm going to apply for it.
Right.
It's a long time to wait, 10 years, but the alternative is pick up your family and relocate. lots of things that maybe aren't options for you. So, sometimes even the market will just show you that there may not be opportunities for me at the institution I'm at, or there may not be the opportunities that I want. I mean, as an administrator, there were many times where we would gather after we found out someone was resigning, and the conversation started with, do we really need that position? Can we break it apart and have others do it? Do we really need to bring in another whole person? So here you are sitting thinking, oh, that position is going to come open. I'm going to apply for it. And then you realize the position's disappearing. We never know. And I think even more so now, higher ed struggles with the same thing everyone else does. We're seeing a mass exodus of retirees. We're seeing a mass exodus of, people wanting to stay in their career. And we're seeing low enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
And we're seeing students saying, I'm not sure college is where I want to be. And right now, people are very concerned about that comment. But if you go back to the late 60s and early 70s, it was the same conversation. The hippie generation said, I don't want to go to college.
Right.
But if you look 5 years later, the war occurred. They started having children and they went, wow, like I need to make an income to support my family. Many of those people went to school.
Yes.
Many of those people just started later. We're going to see that again. There will be a resurgence of people wanting to go to school, but they're going to take some time off. So in that time off, positions are going to disappear. We're not going to refill them. We're going to allow technology to do some of the things that we had somebody doing before. Oftentimes, sadly, somebody retires and we've kind of been waiting for them to retire.
Yes.
We don't really need that role anymore, but we respect that person. We loved having them on staff and we're going to wait them out. So we have no intention of doing anything with that role once it's gone. Mm-hmm. We probably don't even need it in the same respect of when it was hired. So people have to take a look around them as well and kind of read the room and take that in with, what it is that they want to do, where they want to go, getting a coach to help them, finalize that vision and kind of that trajectory of what's next. But right now is a time to do it. We're seeing lots and lots of change.
Absolutely. And what you said was so interesting. And I'm glad you brought up like what was happening in the 60s and how that impacted what I call the landscape of higher ed, right? And I've said this for years and I've got 25 years in higher ed, and I tell people that the landscape is always changing, just like every other landscape. And you have to be able to look at the landscape and say, are we coming in where it's a spring? Is it a winter? Is it a summer? Is it a fall? What season is it? And how does the cycle look? Are we harvesting? Or are we trimming? Right? Mm-hmm. And so these are all sort of metaphors that I use, but I think they fit nicely because sometimes the season could be really compressed, right? We could see a whole season in 6 months, a whole cycle of seasons in 6 months. Or we can look at it over 10 years, 20 years, and we can see sort of the broader changes. And so there's always recovery, but it looks different, right? Mm-hmm. So what I think is going to happen is that some of those positions will come back, some of them won't, some of them will be reimagined. So there were quite a few people that were a bit resistant to hybrid or online. And now, guess what? If you don't do that, you're in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we're seeing calendar changes. We have always been married to either a semester or a quarter system. And we've had 100 reasons why we can't change that. And now suddenly we can change it. We're offering micro learning. We're offering, short courses. We're offering students the ability to double up and be able to graduate sooner. We're taking more AP courses than ever. So we're shortening that window that student needs to be in school, but that means they don't need those services for as long either. So it's an opportunity, when you see that, to look at what do you want to learn to be contributory to that, or what do you want to learn that you're going to go and do something different. I think the other part of it is that people are just realizing after the pandemic that they maybe want to go do something different, and that's okay. Um, a higher ed is a wonderful career, and I'm thankful for it. But you also can get very burned out on it. Teaching, working with students regularly. I think people didn't realize how many hours higher ed administrators and faculty members put in until they started to see it during the pandemic. It was kind of always assumed that, I think, it was a very short schedule. They get the summers off. You always hear people say that. We didn't get the summers off. We were 12-month contracts. We worked all year long. We had lots to do. And so I think sometimes too, it's just a matter of it's time for change. You just get really worn out from it. The pandemic added another layer of stress and anxiety and burnout on that. And so people are now looking, going, what am I going to go do different? I know I want to do something. I want to have a different lifestyle. I want to have a different way of living. And I just want to do the things that I enjoy doing and have less of the policy and procedures.
And so I think you definitely called it right. This is the time to be thinking about what your next steps are, reflecting on where you've come from, where you are now, and if you want to pivot, or if you want to add something, or if you want to enrich, or if you want to scale back. Burnout was high. Just any university position. I know that there was an article early on in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about, student support staff, student support office just being, people were falling apart because so much fell upon them. And it was one of those things where people always thought, what does student services do? They schedule some potlucks every now and then. And it's like, no, they do a lot. That's where students go first. And even when we're doing our welcome weeks, we're always like, student services can help you. So I think that it's important for whether you're faculty, staff, or an administrator to be thinking about, what do you want to do, and being mindful that burnout can happen. We know the research shows us that usually around the 7-year mark that we start to see, a lot of what might happen with the burnout. So this is a good time. And hey, not that there's an upside to a pandemic at all, but this is a time that if you ever needed a reason, you can say, that, well, wow, we're in a 100-year pandemic, so maybe I should be reassessing where I am, because who knows what the future will bring in terms of your institution, your position, and even in terms of your life.
Absolutely. And, you can start to plot out on paper. I mean, as simple as 2 columns. One column is what do you want? And the other column is what do you need? You need an income. What's the dollar amount on that? What are the things that you have coming up that you need to be prepared for? Maybe it's a child going to college. Oftentimes you hear university personnel will stay at an institution so their children can go to school there and have a little bit of a discount. I can, name a half a dozen people that I know who, when their children got 18, said, I don't want to go to school there. I want to go to school somewhere else. So they stayed there, and their kids didn't end up going to school there. So they invested in time and effort, still had a good career, but it didn't work out exactly like they planned. So, I always tell people it's important to lay out what it is that you absolutely need to move this forward. And then what is it that you want? What do you enjoy of your everyday? What is it you enjoy working with? And what are the things that you can pick from that and combine with your skills and your credentials. And then you have to start thinking of yourself as an individual and not as part of an institution. The personal brand is hard for all of us because we've always been associated with some institution that's it's almost our tagline. And now we have to be a standalone. So, you have to think about that. What are you going to do? How, who is going to help you with this? And a coach is a perfect person like yourself to start talking through, what are the things that I need to be looking for or thinking about? Because it's a very different world. But in the end, it's all the same materials. It's just rearranged a little differently.
Well, what I love about what you just laid out there is that you said you so many times, right? You have to think about what works for you. You have to put it on the page. And so I think that what happens is oftentimes, and I don't know that I'm overgeneralizing, but I think oftentimes, and even the research backs me up on this, is that women, we see ourselves as the unit, right? So the family unit, the university or the job unit, and we don't see ourselves as an individual. And so sometimes we end up getting lost in that. And I think it's important to think about what you want as an individual and be a little selfish. Like, of course, you have to consider your family because you're dependent on your family is dependent on you. You have to think about your job. But if you put yourself in the center, a lot of times it can change your viewpoint of like, And so I was so glad you brought up the example of people who have stayed at University X because they thought it's a great place to get an education. And then their kids are like, what are you talking about? I want to go, to University Y. And so that's, 18 years or 16 or what have you. And you committed to that. You wanted to have a career in higher ed, but you stayed at that place for someone else, right? And I think that if we think more broadly about it, because I really, I have a sort of an abundance mindset, realistic, but abundance, right? So if I was planning out what university I would want my kid to go to, I think I'd be like, so I'm going to budget for that and I'm going to go work over here. And I'm going to make sure that I have enough money so that they can have options of wherever they want to go. Don't get me wrong, I love a good discount. But if they ended up wanting to go to attend the university that I'm at, fine. That just is an added bonus, right? So thinking about what you want and what you need is very important. And sometimes it takes working with a coach to kind of sort those things out because we have to get out of our own head because we'll talk ourselves out of things all the time, right? There's 57 good reasons why I should do this and stay here. And then you're working with a coach and they're like, well, they're all good reasons, but they may not be the right reasons for you.
Exactly. Well, so money is always the taboo topic, right? We don't like to talk about money, but think about it. What are you bringing home as a salary now? And is that contributing? Is that extra? Is it necessary? In other words, you're just living paycheck to paycheck. Whatever that is going to determine what are you going to do in a new role, as a new business. So if you're making 50,000 a year and you have a spouse that has income, and so you say, well, 25 of that is really necessary, and 25 of that is, we like to travel and such, it's more fun money. Then 25 is your baseline. You've got to make at least 25,000 in your new business or your new role, whatever it is that you're doing, to not disrupt the household. Then if you make above that, it's just like you are now. You've got that extra. And so that's the conversation that you look at. That's always the toughest one is if I go off and do something else, how is it going to affect this? How is it going to change what we do? How is it going to, affect putting extra money aside so my child can go to school over here or whatever it is that they want? But money is always the first catalyst for us for everything that we do, whether we like it or not. And nobody likes to talk about it, but the fact is that usually drives our decisions. You apply for a job, you're all excited about it, it's a great role, and then they give you the salary range, and you're like, oh, that's less than what I'm making. Not going over there.
Right.
We see it in higher ed all the time, and that's why you go in and if you know your institution, you're like, I know they'll negotiate with me. I know I've got a little window of room, and I could step back and take that just to get in that department. We think through this logically when we're in a structure. We have to do the same thing with our family. We have to do the same
Mhm.
thing at home. Once you do that, the rest of it can fall into place much easier because you start to be able to see the target goals. What do I have to do? What does that mean? How do I make that happen? And then you start to take your skill set and say, oh, all right, I can do this. This can come together. I have a good friend and colleague who, during the pandemic had no speaking engagements because obviously everything shut down. So pivoted his business and started helping people understand how to have better Zoom meetings, how to run them better, how to have groups, how to break out into, small subgroups, all of these things that became a very, very lucrative business for him. He was recently on NPR doing an interview about it. And, he's the first one to tell you he never envisioned doing that. But all of a sudden the well went dry. And he was
Mhm.
like, wow, I've got small children, I've got a spouse, I've got to turn this thing around, figure out something else. So, when you have that dollar amount, that's your first point. You figure out, okay, this is the point I need to get to every month. And so that's what I just need to do, or every year, or whatever it is. But that can help you set up everything and make everything else fall into place a little easier. And it's going to help your coach help you align as well.
So I really like these examples that you've given. And what comes to mind for me is the dollar amount, right? So let's say that you are a faculty member, because we're talking about possibly pivoting, right? And you're exploring some options around pivoting. One of the things that your coach, me, or someone else can help you with is thinking about that dollar amount. So how do you start your small business, right? Whether that's your coaching, whether it's your launching your online your platform for learning. How do you think about that and think about the money and how that can be an added resource? So as you're thinking about pivoting, you have this plan of, okay, everything that I make here is really going to go into a certain fund. So I know how much that I'm making. And then once I actually make enough to transition, then I can. So if I could take another position somewhere, I make a little bit less, it's okay because I have my own small business that I'm running, and that brings in some money as well. So these are all good opportunities. And then, sometimes you do have a situation where your job no longer exists, so that necessity is the mother of invention, right? So you will be able to quickly, hopefully, come up with something. But I'm sure that your friend sort of bounced ideas off of you or used, so this is the thing that I want people to really think about is when you have to reimagine, or even where you have to, or whether you're thinking about it, reimagining, this is the time to really dive in and do some work and reimagine where you want to be and how you can really capture your vision and career advancement. So I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today, Cher. And we could do this forever. So you always have such good tips, and you're such a great role model for people
Oh, thank you.
pivoted or want to pivot, and you've just done an amazing job with your business and how you're coaching people and just being a role model. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, with my pleasure. And I hope your listeners, glean from this and are ready to go to their next chapter.
All right, so once again, I'm Dr. Loren M. Hill, and I'm your academic career coach. Thanks so much for joining us today.